Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. This is Nick Redding. You're listening to PreserveCast again. So excited to have you back with us. And today we're really honored to be sitting down with Dr. Alexis McCrossen, who is a professor of history at Southern Methodist University, where she's been since 1995. She's the author of a bunch of really fascinating books. We were saying before we hit record that we need to have her back. She wrote a book called Holy Day, Holiday, The American Sunday. She wrote a book called Marking Modern Times, Clocks, Watches, and Other Timekeepers in American Life. And now, appropriately, she's working on a history of New Year's observances in the United States, which will hopefully come out soon. It's tentatively titled Times, Touchstone, New Year's in American Life. And so it's so exciting to have you with us here. Perfect timing as we approach this holiday that oftentimes passes. We don't really think about sort of our place in history and the fact that many people before us have celebrated and recognized and observed this date. So we want to dive into all of that. But before we do that, we love to get to know people and introduce people to the audience. So, Dr. McCrossen, where'd you grow up? What led you to this line of work? When did you decide that you were going to dive in into history and become an academic and all of that good stuff? Where did this all start?
Well, first of all, hello. Hi, Nick, and happy to be here. I was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I grew up there. My father had been born and raised in Santa Fe, and I grew up in an old adobe house and with parents who took me to archaeological sites and old Indian pueblos and down to Mexico to all the wonderful sites there. And I always saw the world through the lens of history, always thinking about how old things were, where they came from. And I was also very fortunate to grow up with a grandfather who's the very first thing I remember about him was that he was born in 1898, and that was completely fascinating to me as a child. I just could not get over the fact that he was born in a different century. Now, I was born in the 20th century. Now we're in the 21st. So, but I was so fascinated with him, and every time, and I was very fortunate to see him all the time because he lived in Santa Fe. I peppered him constantly with questions about, well, what was it like before cars? And what did you think about this? And what did you think about that? And so on and so forth. So I think that's where my interest in history just came from my surroundings and from my family and from living in a place where not a lot really changed. New Mexico wasn't a place that was economically especially vibrant, and so buildings remained standing and were reused and repurposed. Rather, as opposed to, I live in Dallas now, and the minute something is dated or no longer useful, it's torn down. We have a lot of creative destruction here in Dallas, but in New Mexico, everything just stayed as it was. And I think that must be part of where my orientation to history came from.
So it's fascinating, though, that like the history that you've focused in on and you've studied, I don't know if it's non-traditional, but there are these sort of groupings of sort of more traditional areas of study, and you've kind of zeroed in on time itself, and like how we mark time, days that we take off, how we keep time. Where did the fascination with time itself come from? How do you specialize into that? Because obviously now this next book is another thing about the marking of a specific time and a date in the calendar and why we celebrate the way we do. It's all about time and date and watches and all that kind of cool stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, I'll go back to that being just fascinated with the calendar date. And my grandfather had been born on April 1st, April Fool's Day. So I'm just going to take it all right back to him. So I was fascinated with 1898. I was fascinated by April 1st. These sort of dates, time. My father never wore a watch, but he was always on time. He always knew what time it was, so that intrigued me in various ways. And then, of course, as a child, you grow up in a regimented world, right? A world of school bells and schedules, and I think I always was chafing at the regimentation. What does it mean that we only have class for 50 minutes? What if we're not done with our work yet? So that the conflict, right, between sort of task orientation and time orientation was a part of my own psychology in a way. I'm very time oriented. I'm very clock oriented. Notice immediately when I've gone over time or other people have. So I think that part of it is my own internal makeup. When I was in graduate school and I was beginning to think about what to do a dissertation about, I was I was very intrigued with the texture of daily life. What was the question? What was it like? And that's not a question that professional historians really focus on, academic historians, right? They're more focused on change over time, right? The history is a study of change over time, or the study of why didn't things change over time, and what was it like is a kind of different kind of historical question. I was really interested in that. I think particularly because the 20th century was a century of such tremendous technological change and tremendous change in terms of knitting the world together. I mean, and also tearing the world apart right through war. But technology is knitting the world together. War is tearing the world apart. I was very conscious of that as a child. So when I began to think about my dissertation, we had the what was it like question. Well, I was studying at Harvard University, and they weren't going to put up with that. And so the other set of questions that were really intriguing to me were questions about consciousness and mentality, about the kind of the world of the kind of experience. What were people thinking, experiencing, feeling? There was a historian named Raymond Williams, a British historian, and he wrote about the structure of feeling and made a very persuasive set of arguments that different historical periods provided different structures of feeling in which people would experience, say, melancholy or grief or depression or excitement, and actually historically specific and historically contingent sorts of ways. And so I began to sort of search around for a dissertation that would let me explore those questions. What was it like? And then these questions about structures of feeling. And actually, time really lends itself to those sorts of questions. So when I began to think about, well, what structures of time were in place that might have changed? And so, of course, Sunday was a kind of natural place to look, because our understanding of the meaning for Sunday and of the use of the day changed pretty dramatically over a relatively short period of time. And so that gave me a lot to look into. And then that book led into the clocks and watches, because it was like, okay, well, I've done the calendar. What about clocks and watches? I thought that would be an easy little thing, but it turned out it wasn't. And then I moved. When I had been working on, we're getting to the new year, when I had been working on the Clocks and Watch book, I'm very interested in visual culture and visual representations. I love to illustrate my books, and not just to illustrate them, but to look at visual sources as historical sources. And I had found a kind of series of photographs of tall case clocks, grandfather clocks, that were inscribed, New Year 1909. The hands are set to midnight to 12. I mean, it wouldn't be midnight. No, they were set to 12. And a toddler, a naked toddler, would be stepping out of the case of the clock. And I was like, what is this? This is the strangest iconography. I'm fascinated by this. And when I figured out, like, oh, this is the new year stepping out of the clock, even though the new year is a calendar measure of time, right? But here's the new year, the little baby stepping out of the clock. Then I began to be very interested in the new year and observances of the new year and representations of it. And so thus this third book that I'm still working on.
It's fascinating in that, like, we talk to a lot of different people, but this is a very like humanistic approach to academic study, right? It's almost as if you had to find the lane in which Harvard and the academy would let you study this sort of thing, but you are sort of approaching what was it like, and how did things change, and why did they change the way that they did, and why did people live the way that they did? And I feel like time is central to all of that. And so much of it we just take for granted too. Like, I think we just think, well, there's always been this sort of standardized time. And I've worked at Civil War sites where, you talk about there was no standardization in the 1860s like there was after the railroads in the 1870s, and they kind of set this sort of thing. So it was very hard to kind of understand, even when reading records, like when people want to know with specificity when they come to a site, well, what time did this thing happen? And, and there's like 10 different answers. And so you kind of just have to, you have to ballpark it. Well, it's essentially the afternoon, sometime before twilight, and so it's like there's that, I forget who said it, but the past is this foreign place. And,
right.
And it is in some ways, particularly when it comes to things that we're just so accustomed to being, set and stayed in its ways. So for New Year's Eve and for the New Year's celebration, I guess in my mind, maybe I'm sure this is my own bias. It sort of has this like 1920s-ish feel to it, because it's got, sort of that vibe to it, and that, the Art Deco, which I'm sure is kind of tied into Times Square. But it obviously goes back a lot further. Like, how do you put the celebration of the New Year? Obviously, you're looking at it through the lens of American life, but were the Americans the first to celebrate it? How far back does it kind of go? What is the kind of like the big picture of the New Year's celebration?
Wow. Okay. So, first of all, it seems that regardless of the way of measuring the year, so different cultures at different times have had the beginnings and the endings of their years on different dates, right? So we could talk about, say, the Aztec calendar, or we could talk about the Balinese way of measuring the year, or the Chinese New Year, right, which is a lunar way of measuring the year. But in any case, and across time and space, in human history, the New Year has brought with it rites and rituals, sometimes celebrations. Sometimes, as in Bali, the New Year is welcomed with silence. It's a day of silence. So there's a ritual to it. But the point is that it is marked in some way or another, by which again would be historically determined and contingent. So for the history of the United States, the most useful kind of origin point for us to look at is the Roman Empire. And they celebrated what they called the Calends of January. Now, the Kalends is spelled Kalends. And what it meant was the first of the month. So there was a Kalends of January, a Kalends of April, of May. It was the first day of the month. And there would be different rites and rituals that would go with that first day. Some would be relatively small. Maybe a priest, in one of the temples might have to make an offering. But with the Kalends of January, as we call it, is named after Janus. Janus was the two-faced deity who looked both forward and backward, right? So the 1st of January was the first of the year, and you looked forward and backward, and there were a series of kind of rites and rituals in ancient Rome that involved several things that we might find familiar. One is paying what in early modern Europe they called the compliments of the season. That is, giving each other New Year's greetings. Happy New Year to you. Happy New Year to you. The compliments of the season. And that these were kind of ritualized expressions. We say it offhandedly, Happy New Year, but there's actually a lot of there's a lot of meaning behind that, because you're actually wishing to a person a happy new year, a good new year, a healthy new year, and that this was a ritual expression. The sovereign would throw coins out to the people, and maybe also throw them a good show, maybe a circus or some kind of spectacle. There were parades in the streets. And by the same token, the people would bring tribute to the sovereign. So would bring, and this tribute, in many ways, we could see it today as taxes, right? I'm going to pay my tribute to the sovereign. I got to pay him the taxes. Okay. There were gifts given at the New Year's, and they were considered to be gifts for good luck. And they were named in Latin, they were called strena. And that was from the goddess Strena, and one word we know today is strenuous, but which is, we think of it as meaning something very difficult, strenuous, hard, but it also means strength, right? Think of all these words, the derivation of them, and so you would give gifts to help people have that happy new year. These tokens. Well, another word that came from Strena was the word in French, étren, and étren means tip. And that's another legacy we have today, right? That bonus, right? The New Year's bonus, or the holiday tip or gift that we might give people who work for us or work with us, or the doorman of the building. Or if you go out during the holidays, you might tip more generously than you normally do. Your hairdressers, you bring them, not only do you tip them generously, but you bring them gifts. And so there's a kind of reciprocity of gift giving at the new year that I think is still very much with us today. So we can go all the way back to ancient Rome. Okay, now what happened then when the Roman Empire fell is that, remember, the Romans had colonized much of Europe, and one way or another their influence spread right all the way to the British Isles. And so some of the customs around the new year remained, but then were adapted by various groups. And one group that from whom we have inherited a lot were the Germans and the German tribes. And they began in the 5th, 6th century to celebrate something called Saint Sylvester's Eve and Saint Sylvester's Day. Saint Sylvester had been a pope, and they took New Year's celebrations and they turned them into a celebration of Saint Sylvester, which involved bonfires on the night before the new year. It involved making toasts and exchanging kisses at the new year. So the New Year's kiss, and as the years went by, and Germany became a state, right, feudal states, and then these practices became very formalized. They had huge parties at New Year's on New Year's Eve, and many German immigrants who came to the United States brought those customs with them, and Americans who had inherited a different set of customs, right, from the Protestants, from Puritans, and didn't celebrate New Year's at all. Didn't
That's
even
what
know.
I was going to guess
Right.
that the Puritans,
Yeah.
much like Christmas, I mean, there was just not a lot of frivolity and fun at that
No,
time of the year.
no. New Year, January 1 for most colonial Americans, with one exception, the Dutch in New York, which we can talk about in a minute, was just like the first day of the month. It didn't matter. It was completely irrelevant to them, and passed without any notice. The Dutch in New York had brought over the custom of New Year's Day visiting, so they didn't do anything with New Year's Eve. I mean, New Year's Eve is kind of complicated when you don't have well-functioning clocks and watches, and you don't have, I mean, you had gaslight for illumination, but when you don't have reliable illumination, how are you going to know when it's midnight in the middle of the night without reliable clocks, watches, and without some kind of illumination?
I have to imagine that I'm just guessing here, but
Yeah,
and you would know, but that the whole midnight piece comes in as you have far more standardized time, right? I mean,
right.
that's got to be, and people having watches and clocks and things like that. That must be a component of that.
Absolutely, exactly. And I mean, and so New Year's Day was the day. Okay, New Year's Day was the what people celebrated. They woke up on New Year's and began to celebrate. And the Dutch in New York, they brought over the custom of New Year's Day visits, and the female members of a household would put together a kind of reception with punch and whiskeys and cherry brandy, and cookies were very important. These New Year's cookies and other pickled oysters, and the men would often in small groups would go from house to house to pay the compliments of the season, have a cookie and a sip of cherry cordial, exchange kisses, maybe see who the pretty young women were, and then move on to the next house. And these New Year's Day visits were very important for keeping that kind of relationships between families, and also establishing new relationships. So, but the rest of the country is not celebrating New Year's at all. Midnight New Year's Eve is not celebrated. There were some people out in the streets, usually young men who were making mischief of various kinds. And at the turn of the 19th century, Methodists began to gather for watch night services at New Year's, in which they would pray and sermonize and sing hymns together and wait for the moment of midnight. But each minister would sort of determine when midnight was for himself and have a kind of revival of sorts. When the Germans come over, they bring their convivial big New Year's parties and customs, and those have a big influence on Americans in cities because they see how much fun the Germans are having, and how special New Year's Eve could be. And this coincides then with precision, the standardization of time, precision timekeeping, and then the electrification of cities. And thus, around the turn of the 20th century, people are coming out on New Year's Eve and expecting excitement and anticipating that magic moment of midnight.
It's interesting. How boring would the holidays be without the Germans? I mean,
I know.
we wouldn't have Christmas trees. We wouldn't have New Year's Eve the way we know it. I mean, they really add a certain panache to all this. So, not to take too much credit here as Americans, but is the New Year's that we know today largely a function of sort of this collection of all these different trends and ethnic traditions all into is the American New Year's the one that then proliferates across the world, or do other societies sort of come to this at their own time? Do the British do this as well? Or is it that everybody's like, oh, well, that looks like fun what they're doing in New York. We want to do that too. Or is it a little bit of both?
It's a little bit of both. The New Year's out in the street, celebration, waiting for the moment of midnight. I mean, there are bells that are ringing. There are fireworks being set off, in Sydney and London and Paris and Berlin and Rome. And so in that sense, in Moscow, in that sense, there's it's part of modernity, right? The arrival of modernity, of these big urbanized or urban areas, industrialized areas, capitalistic. There's more. People have more disposable income. There is an entertainment sector that's emerging, that's seeking to capitalize on particular spaces of time, like the nighttime, in which there's money to be made if only you can, attract people to come to your venue, and to come out. There's also, right at the end of the 19th century, a lot of emphasis on publicity, on media, on advertising, on grabbing attention. And New Year's Eve becomes this sort of premier attention grabbing moment, because that there's a kind of captive audience. There are people waiting for something to happen. And if you can provide that something, then you'll at least for a moment get a little bit of a boost. And so newspapers in Western Europe and in the United States were particularly interested in New Year's Eve as a kind of moment to grab the public's attention and perhaps veneration. So it wasn't just the New York Times that provided a spectacle, but all of the newspapers tried to stage their own spectacles on New Year's Eve. And it was part of Adolph Ochs's genius. He had purchased the New York Times in the 1890s, and his flair for publicity was pretty astounding. And it was part of his genius to move his building up out of where all the what was called Press Row or Newspaper Row, down by City Hall in Lower Manhattan. And he moved up to Longacre Square, built that Times building, which was kind of useless as a newspaper building, but fantastic, right, as an icon. And he fooled around from the building opened, debuted on New Year's Day, 1905, or actually at midnight, 1905, and he started to fool around with what spectacle would grab attention, what would basically suck all the attention away from all of the other spectacles in New York City at that time. And there were a number of pretty good spectacles staged on New Year's Eve out in public. And, first he tried fireworks, he tried searchlights, and then for on New Year's 1908, he figured out the illuminated time ball, and that was the one. That was the thing. He it's still with us to this day. The thing is that even though the New York Times proclaimed it the new thing for the new year, that time ball, It was still a kind of a local observance. It was known in New York City and in New Jersey and the environs, but it wasn't a nationally, let alone an internationally famous event until the 1920s and then into the 30s. And I would argue it doesn't become a real global event until the 1970s and 1980s. And we can think about the kind of growth of a kind of global media and the Times Square tracks with that.
Well, I was going to ask, I mean, that's a good kind of lead into this is where will your study kind of come to an end? We talk about time, right?
Right.
Because I'm curious if you're even sensing trends and changes in the way New Year's is celebrated and observed to this day. Are there, because you're talking about how, it becomes more global by, the New York, the Times Square celebration becomes more global by the 70s and 80s. So are we seeing even trends? And I mean, I'm sure we are seeing those, but where will you cut your study off and kind of, and complete and then say, it's on for the next person to figure out what happens after that?
What happens next? Well, I'm a historian, so I'm never really that comfortable in the present or in any time period, even close to the present. So the 21st century, I definitely will not write about. I observe and I watch. I also recognize, I'm in my 50s, and New Year's for me is really different than I have a daughter in her early 20s. It's just a really different. I can't see what New Year's means to her. So as somebody in her 50s, I'm not interested in going out on New Year's Eve to a club or dancing. That's not my kind of New Year's. So part of the challenge with a study like this is we have to, there are different people at different stages of their life cycles. And all holidays are going to mean different things to us. A birthday is a very different thing for a 6-year-old than for a 60-year-old. And New Year's is a very different thing for a 6-year-old than for a 60-year-old. So part of the challenge of my study is to try to sort that out. And in that sense, in terms of the trends up to this day, it's really hard for me to see what those trends are, but I can see very clearly where I am going to end my study is with the emergence of the countdown. Now, we all might assume that New Year's was counted down, since clocks were around. But the fact of the matter is that the midnight wasn't counted down. People waited for midnight, but they didn't count down 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's a very new, very 20th century addition. And it's actually a late 20th century addition. The countdown to New Year's comes after two very important kinds of countdowns that suffused and maybe even characterized the 20th century. And one would be the countdown that was used when dropping bombs, particularly the atomic bomb, and a televised A-bomb test that counted down to the release of the bomb and its detonation. And the most famous iteration of that would be in that presidential election ad for Lyndon Johnson in the 1964 election, the Daisy ad with the little girl, but she gets the count wrong. Right. So and then there's the booming voice of the announcer for the bomb drop over that. Right. They ran that ad only once. And that's an apocalyptic kind of countdown, a countdown to zero that suffused the imagination and the consciousness of post-World War II people, particularly during the Cold War. And then there was another kind of countdown that emerged around the same time, and that was the countdown that was used for rocket launches, particularly rocket launches into space. And those countdowns became very famous because those rocket launches were televised. And this is what we could call a Genesis countdown, right? A countdown to some kind of new beginning, to exploration, to discovery, to something wonderful and magnificent like landing on the moon. So those two countdowns become very prevalent and start to characterize different kinds of cultural formations. You get children's games with countdowns in them. You get television shows. The most famous one is a British one called Countdown. You get countdowns to the top 10 hits, right, on your weekly both radio and TV shows. And so by the 1970s, announcers who are kind of doing the play-by-play for the New Year's ball drop begin to count it down. And then by the end of the 70s, the crowd itself in Times Square begins to count the ball down as well.
What
So
a
it's kind of a
fascinating,
beautiful thing.
that is really, really fascinating. And then Dick Clark, I guess, makes it really cool,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I mean,
He's the one who grabs it. There was this other guy named Ben Grauer. He was an older announcer. So he had been a very famous radio and TV announcer beginning in the 30s, and his heyday was the 50s and the 60s. And he would count down on the radio. He tried in order to try to bring it to life visually for the radio listener. He would count it down, but Dick Clark is the one who made it all, brought it all together. And so I think that's where I'll end my book.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess here's the question: what's the countdown to the book? How long until we see it?
Oh, there's accountability here. I have a New Year's resolution for 2025, and that's to get this book to my publisher. There are a lot of other stories that I'm telling in the book besides the joyful one that we've talked about today.
Right.
New Year's was known among African Americans and enslaved people in the South in the 19th century as Heartbreak Day, because it was the day in which new hiring happened, and many enslaved people were hired out for the year by their enslavers. And New Year's Day was the day that families then were broken up when people went to their new employers or enslavers. And so it was known as Heartbreak Day, and I'm writing a lot about that. And also the flip side of Heartbreak Day, of course, is the Emancipation Proclamation signed on New Year's Day. So there's that story to tell, and some other stories that aren't quite so uplifting as Times Square.
Yeah. And I think it's all tied into this idea as well as we approach the 250th anniversary of the founding of the nation and the Declaration of Independence, that sort of these dates become sort of markers and milestones as well. And you don't have that without the year and the year being tied into that. So, I mean, I think that there's sort of this whole anniversary story tied into this too, which is interesting. And, obviously the Emancipation Proclamation being one of those that, actually happens on January 1st too, which is unique. So, I guess it's perfect timing, right? With big anniversaries coming
Right.
up.
Right.
What are you, I mean, I know you're just working on getting this one out now, but I'm sure you always have sort of ideas about what comes next. Did you have the New Year's baby moment with this study where you said, wow, that's fascinating, and I wonder what this part of it is, and that then it becomes the next book? Do you even sort of have a vision of what comes beyond this?
Well, one thing that I've become interested in is I'm still very interested in what the experience, the mentality, the consciousness of time was. And it's to figure that out is very difficult, right? Because even if here you are, you're a living person, we're sitting here, we're talking together. And yet if I were to try to figure out your time consciousness, what questions would I ask you? and I have you, right? So as a historian, my subjects are gone, right? So all I have are the records that they left, and the detritus, right, of the past, and the records can be all sorts of records, and I'm beginning to think a lot about looking at the records of people who broke rules about the time. And I'm thinking in particular about soldiers who went AWOL, right, absent without leave, and because AWOL is a kind of way of reclaiming one's time. And when they returned, maybe they returned 2 or 3 days after they were supposed to, there would be a court-martial trial, and they would have to account for themselves. What were you doing? Why didn't you return? And those records, I think I'm looking at records from World War I, I think might give me a picture of the time consciousness of at least of a particular group, a group of enlisted men who were all born around the same time, right? So generationally, it might be a good sample. So I'm looking into that. I've been thinking a lot about that. It may be a dead end. I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating too, because I at least have this sense that we are a time-obsessed society right now, that everything is so regimented, and that the computer, the ones and zeros have made that even simpler to do, right? I mean, we can track employees based on how much time they're spending, and attorneys, have it down to the minute. They have a little timer on their computer to make sure they're getting every last minute, timed correctly. And so that would be fascinating to know, like, to what extent has that grown or not? Or am I wrong? Were they just as obsessed or just as concerned about time then? I get this sense that we were more interested or aware of natural time versus sort of this artificial time that we put on ourselves. But there's time debates even to this day. We have a president-elect who has talked about changing standard time and daylight savings, and that would even be something that would be mentioned in such a momentous period. Obviously suggests that there's still a battle going on about how we mark time. And so I guess there's good job security for a historian of time, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
I hope so.
Well, this has been, just absolutely fascinating. We're going to have you back. I want to talk about your book about Sunday in the future, because before we hit record, we were sort of saying, like, that plays out in the landscape and how we preserve things. And of course, that the same can be said for this book about New Year's and all the other work that you've done. Just fascinating. So much fun to talk with you. And I appreciate you having the time to come and speak with us before New Year's. So I guess I'll just end it by saying Happy New Year's.
Well, thank you, Nick. Happy New Year to you, too.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to preservecast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.